Hello and welcome to this webinar. My name is Frans Lützen. I'm CTO of New Orbit. Today we'll be talking about GDPR, how it affects software and how Azure can help. New Orbit is a software development company. We've been building software in Azure since 2011, as well as helping other companies move their software up to Azure. A lot of our systems have a lot of personal data in them, so we've always had to be at the forefront of using a lot of the security features in Azure, some of which I'll mention today. And in addition, as you may imagine, with GDPR, we've spent a lot of time and energy looking at GDPR and how it affects the systems that we build for our clients. So before I say anything else, I need to just say I'm not a lawyer. I can't give you any legal advice. I do want to prompt you to ask questions, but I would also strongly advise you to actually seek legal advice if there's anything you're concerned about. With GDPR, there's a lot of hype about it, so I just want to sort of cover why you should care about GDPR before we sort of look at the details. Firstly, it is data protection done right. The old Data Protection Act was fairly limited and was really just the minimum the government could get away with at the time. Personally, I think that GDPR is, as a consumer, it feels like it's the right thing and it really sets out to try and protect people. Now, even if that doesn't matter to you, you should know that now the maximum fine you can get is 20 million euros or 4% of your turnover. So to put that into context, in 2016, TalkTalk had a data breach where they lost about 150,000 people's data. They got fined order £400,000. Under GDPR, that would be closer to £60 million. So this is quite serious. Also, you now have to report data breaches to the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, and usually to those that are affected by the data breach. It used to be you could get away with just, if nobody knew about it, you could possibly get away with not letting anybody know. That's no longer feasible. And if you don't report a data breach, you will definitely be fined when it comes out, because it always comes out in the end. The Information Commissioner's Office are very sensible people, and you might have imagined, or some might imagine, they're not going to enforce this. Well, they've already hired an additional 200 lawyers last May in order to start enforcing this. So they're definitely going to be looking at GDPR. Brexit is not going to stop GDPR. The law has very much been adopted by the British government as their own. And besides, we wouldn't be able to trade with the EU if we didn't obey it. And the final date for compliance is 25th of May, 2018. So not a lot of time. Just to cover the principles of the GDPR, first of all, because this is where a lot of people come unstuck. The old Data Protection Act was very technical. It was very much about saying you can store this piece of data in this way for this long. This law, the new law, is much better to think of it as human rights law. It's really about protecting the fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals. If you read the law, that phrase is there everywhere. So think about not what you can technically do with data you can technically store, but think about what you do with the data and think about how that affects the person that you're doing it on. That's really the key to it. Think of it in terms of rights and human rights rather than technical data. I'm going to cover a few of the specific areas that you need to think about in your software. The first of those is consent. And that's one that's been a lot of talk about. So firstly, you need to go consent from people to how you're going to use or process their data. You can't get consent to store their address. You can get consent to send marketing material to their home address. Secondly, and this is where there's a lot of misunderstandings, you don't need to get consent for just doing the core piece, performing the contract. So for example, imagine I have an online bicycle shop and I sell bikes through it. If I want to ask you for your address so I can send the bike to you that you bought from me, and I don't need for your consent to do that. I do need your consent if I want to send you marketing material later on. Consent now has to be actively and freely given. So you know the old thing about you pre-select the tick boxes and you write the sentences in a very weird way so people can't figure out whether to tick it or untick it. That's just no longer allowed. It has to be very clear. And also, importantly, you can't say to people they must consent to something extra. So let's say you wanted to say, I'm going to give you some free training in return for your consent that I can market to you. That's not allowed anymore. You can't force people to consent to anything, even in return for a free service. quite importantly, it must be as easy to withdraw consent as it was to give it. So you can't tell people to call up on Tuesdays between 9 and 10 to withdraw consent. If they ticked a box on a website to give consent, they need to be able to untick a box on a website to take the consent away. For some systems with transient users, that's going to be a big challenge. The second one is subject access request. And it's basically, it's the same old thing we've had for years. People can contact you and say, oh, please give me all the data you have about me. Now, there's various restrictions on that. But the key thing is that in the olden days, you could charge them £10 each time they did this. Now you have to do it for free. Now, again, there are some variations on that, but that's generally the rule. So there's very much an expectation that we're going to see people doing this a lot more. So you need to be prepared for that. And also, there's nothing stopping anybody from doing a social media campaign where they target your company and says, oh, let's all go and ask company X for our personal data, and you have to deal with that, and you have to be able to deal with that. When you do it, it has to be in a common electronic format, so you can't no longer use the old trick of sending a van full of paper around to the house. That's not allowed anymore. And finally, GDPR encourages you to build an online portal for submitting the request. You don't have to, but if you don't, and then you get overrun and you can't handle all of the access requests, you're probably not going to get a lot of sympathy if you haven't actually built a portal. Erasure and retention. So most of this was the same in the old law, but they're going to enforce it a lot more now. The first thing is people can ask you to delete their data. There are variations on that. There are scenarios where you can say no. But if you're building software, you have to think about how can I be able to go in and delete somebody's data and make sure you build those capabilities into your software without breaking things. You can only collect data you need. Again, always been the case, but it's going to be enforced a lot more. And so that speculative thing where you ask for people's birthday because it would be nice to know the age of your customers, you really can't do that anymore. You can only keep the data for as long as you actually need it. And that's an interesting one. So going back to my bicycle shop example. So I've sent you the bike, and then in principle, I should probably delete your address straight away. That is at least the starting point because I've sent you the bike. And I have to argue up from that. So for example, I might have to argue, well, I need to be able to do a bike recall if it finds out there's a problem with it, or I might be able to handle your warranty and so on, and therefore I can keep the data for that long. But the starting point is, as soon as I've done the primary thing, I've got to delete the data. I can't just keep it because it makes for nice MI reports. Anonymization and pseudonymization is something there's a lot of confusion around, so I just want to sort of deconflict that a little bit. Firstly, anonymized data is defined, and I'm just going to read that, a determined person cannot connect it to a real person. So even if you combine it with other data, so you can combine it with your telephone logs or other systems, and if you can combine them and find the person, then it's not anonymous. So if you imagine you have the department and a company somebody worked in but nothing else, well, that's not anonymous because some departments only have 1 or 2 people in them. Or if you have a postcode, even just a postcode on its own is not anonymous because some postcodes only have 1 house in them. So actually anonymizing data is really hard to do, but if you do manage it, it's no longer personal data and therefore not covered by the GDPR. Now, pseudonymization is very explicitly mentioned in the GDPR, and it means that you remove a lot of personal data from the data you keep. So people sort of get this a bit wrong, where they think this means that they are now exempt. They're not. It's still personal data. It's just lower risk. So what you're saying with pseudonymization is that you're reducing the risk of this data. You're not making it not covered by the GDPR. So that's a very important distinction. You can only remove it from the GDPR by completely anonymizing it. So profiling and AI, I think we're all very excited about, all these things we can now do with machine learning and AI. And again, if you use anything in Azure, you can, build MI tools there, and you can do a lot of automated decisioning. And that's great, and we can do a lot with that. However, as an individual, if your system is doing any decisioning or profiling on me, I have a right to say to you, no, I want a human being to do that manually and then explain to me how they did it. There's lots of good reasons for that, including MI and ML has a tendency to make assumptions about biases in society and so on. So there are good reasons for this. But it does sort of put a spanner in the works. And it does mean you have to think quite carefully if you're building systems that use ML and AI a lot. On that note, special categories, gender, religion, race, and so on, you are basically not allowed to use that except in special circumstances. So the default is you can't use any of that in decisioning systems unless you have a special case. And finally, I just want to say, if you're going to use automated decision making, especially because it's early and it's a gray area, I would definitely advise you to get a lawyer involved quite early on, or a specialist in this area. Those are the key things that when you're building software that you should think about. Now, coming to where Azure can help. So what Azure can do is, of course, help you with the hosting. And I'm just going to cover some of the systems in Azure that can help you meeting your GDPR requirements. Firstly, the slight challenge is that the GDPR is very, very, very non-specific. And they've done that on purpose because they don't want to be tied to specific technology. But it means when you're looking in the law to find out, so what does it say about my backup retention strategy or anything like that? And it doesn't say anything. It has some very vague principles, and the idea is you interpret them, and then as technology moves on, the interpretation should move along with it. That also means that whatever you do today that is good enough today might not be good enough tomorrow. So everything I'm about to say is my interpretation of what's probably a good idea. I have had other people look at it, but it is just an interpretation. You need to judge that against your particular case, and especially the sensitivity of the data that you hold. The principles in the GDPR are as follows. Firstly, systems must be secure by design and by default. That is the primary thing they have to say. That one sentence is the primary thing in the GDPR about how you need to host your software. So you need to interpret what that means. There's a few other bits, including, and this is important, you need to ensure that your processing is done in a manner that ensures appropriate security, etc., etc. Now, the important bit here is that there's an obligation on you to make sure that you're doing this in a safe way. That isn't just technological, it's also organizational. Now, I'm not going to cover the organizational aspects today, but there's a whole host of things you need to think about in terms of internal processes and a need-to-know culture and how you keep track of who has access to what data and so on. You need to report the data breaches within 72 hours of becoming aware. Again, I mentioned that before. The thing is, the becoming aware piece. So you might be tempted to think, oh, I just need to make sure I can't become aware. The truth is that you also have an obligation to build those capabilities so that you will be notified if there's a breach. So that means, in other words, if there is a breach and you don't become aware, you might not be in breach of the not reporting it thing, but you are in breach of not having built the capability to detect the breach in the first place. So basically, you really have to build tools and systems that can tell you that there has been a breach. And I will come on to some of the tools Azure has that can help you with that. Now, encryption is the only technology mentioned specifically in the law. You don't have to do it, but they talk about it a lot in the law. And again, if you don't use encryption and you have a data breach, again, you're probably not going to be painted in a very favorable light in court. And finally, a bit of a weird quirk, but it's an interesting one, is that if you lose the data, so let's say you have a database and somehow you delete the database by accident and you don't have a backup, that is a data breach. You have to report it and you have to treat it like a data breach. Feels a bit weird, but if you think about it, it's because there might be data in that system that somebody's circumstances depend on, and therefore you are making them worse off by losing the database. Now, again, being in Azure and the triple redundancy and everything in Azure helps you an awful lot with that. You have to work quite hard to get rid of data in Azure. So that's quite nice. Yes, I did choose the most cheesy picture I could find of a hacker. If you have a better one, send it to me on Twitter and I will use it for the next presentation. So the first thing you do before you even think about what you're doing hosting-wise is actually make sure your code is secure. And it sounds banal, but it is really important because it doesn't matter how secure your hosting environment is. If your code is not secure, it doesn't matter. And Azure cannot help you against bad code. So train developers on OWASP, make sure you do that. Make sure you have code reviews. I find it's a very effective tool to find security problems in code. Build a security-aware culture. So make sure you talk about security at your development team meetings. Make sure that when you have found a security flaw, you discuss it in the team meeting, because you will find a lot of developers don't know security. That's just not what they're in it to do. And it's especially a subject that only some people are interested in. So you've got to push and push and push for the developers to be aware. You should do penetration tests. There are tools you can run yourself, or you can pay people to do it. And it's probably worthwhile doing a bit of both. It can be expensive to get them done externally, so you don't want to do it all the time. But, as I said, there are tools you can just run yourselves. You might want to consider some static code analysis tools. There are a few of them out there, and they will try and analyze your code for security flaws. I'd say They have mixed results, but it's certainly something to consider as an extra tool, but certainly don't rely on it as your only line of defense. Looking through what you can practically do specifically on Azure, the first thing to do is lock down your infrastructure to reduce the risk of people coming in. So Azure VNets sounds like virtual nets. You might think of VPNs. It's not really the same thing. An Azure VNet is like a mini firewall with little rules on it and so on. So strongly advise you to use those. You can put your storage account, you can put your databases, and you can put your VMs and background services into the VNet, which means they cannot be accessed from the internet, and you have complete control over who can get access to them. That's a really good first step. Secondly, if you have things like Azure SQL, Cosmos DB, and so on, make sure you set up the firewalls and lock them down. Keep monitoring them to make sure that you don't have all sorts of IP addresses open up to the world. I strongly recommend using Azure Active Directory for the authentication for all of your ops people. If you can tie it to Office 365, so much the better. It means that you can have two-factor authentication for anybody logging into the Azure portal, even logging into Azure SQL, which is quite nice, using two-factor authentication on SQL access. I would also advise you to look at Azure Key Vault for storing all of your secrets. So what you might be used to is taking your connection strings and all of your different passwords and so on and storing them in, say, app settings in Azure App Services, for example. The problem is anybody with access to the portal can then go and read that data, and then they can go and impersonate the application against your database or whatever, and then you won't know that it was an individual who did it. You think it was the app doing it. With Azure Key Vault, you can store all of those secrets in Azure Key Vault, and then, of course, the next question becomes, but where do I store the password for Azure Key Vault? And then if you can get to that, you are no better off. So that's where managed service identity comes in. It's a bit complicated, but basically it allows you to have a way on an app service or a VM or various other services that can get an access token to Azure Key Vault that can only be issued to the application running on that machine. And then you use that to log into Key Vault, and that means you're now getting secrets that cannot possibly be retrieved by a human being. And that's really the way to do it. Encryption. So a few different layers to this. The first one, you should have encryption at rest. So that means whatever gets stored on disk should be encrypted. Across Azure these days, it's just a tick, and more often than not, it's pre-selected. So you have it in SQL, you have it in Cosmos, you have it in storage and so on. Just make sure that box is ticked, and that's really it. There's some older storage accounts you can't do it. You have to migrate them, which is a bit of a pain, but you can definitely do it. You should consider also this thing called SQL Always Encrypted. It is a way of encrypting certain fields transparently in your application at the database driver level. So that means that you write the data as you're normally used to, and then the database driver encrypts it before it leaves your application. So it goes to the database already encrypted. That can be very powerful for certain scenarios. There is still limited query and searching functionality on that, but of course you can't do everything because it's encrypted in the database. Similar for all the Azure storage, there's a way in the SDK for Azure storage to tell your application to encrypt the data before it goes to blob storage. And you just have to set it up and then it's done for you. It integrates with Key Vault as well, so that can do all your certificate management. So it's a bit of setup, but once you've done it, your data is encrypted in such a way that even somebody with legitimate access to the backend storage containers cannot read the data. It's also worth mentioning something called Azure SQL data masking. So what that is it's a way to tell Azure SQL that if this user goes on, the data in this column should be masked, and if this other user logs on, it should just give them the raw data. And it can be useful for things like, let's say you don't want to encrypt some data in the database, but you don't want your support team being able to read it, for example, say an email address or something like that. And that's where data masking can be really useful. And finally, fairly obvious, but you always need to use end-to-end encryption. So make sure that your connection to SQL, your connection to Azure Storage, your connection to Cosmos DB is done over encrypted connections. That should be obvious, but it's worth mentioning. There's a couple of tools in Azure that I just want to highlight to you. Firstly, for analyzing your exposure, so this is finding out where you're exposed. Firstly, Azure Security Center is a very powerful tool that looks right across everything you have in Azure and identifies things where it thinks you haven't quite configured it right, you haven't switched certain security features on and so on. It gives you a score, and you can use that to see everything, and it will highlight things you might want to look at. Specifically for Azure SQL, and I should probably mention Azure SQL, the team in Azure SQL has done a lot of work about making that a very, very secure environment. And if your data is highly sensitive, I really recommend Azure SQL over the other persistent stores just because of all the security features. They are way ahead of anything else. So SQL vulnerability assessment, for example, runs a lot of static checks on your database to find out if you have got too many users with too many privileges, and if you have various different configuration things on your SQL Azure. You can baseline that and then come back so you can keep track of changes that are happening over time. A new tool very specific to GDPR, very pertinent to GDPR, is a SQL data classification tool, which, using a bunch of rules, will look at your database and identify columns it thinks might have sensitive data in it. It then allows you to tag them and classify them, and then allows you to run audit reports on access to the sensitive data specifically rather than just everything. It's a very powerful tool, and it's worth running even when you think you don't have sensitive data, because you just might. We talked about how to stop attacks, and that's fine, but what about how do you detect that somebody is attacking your system, whether that's from inside or from outside? Because a lot of the time you might find it's actually somebody internally accessing data they shouldn't. Might not even be maliciously, but they're just doing things they shouldn't be doing because they think they're doing the right thing. So there's a few tools for that in Azure. So firstly, Azure SQL Threat Detection. Very powerful little tool, not free but not expensive, and it will basically use machine learning to baseline the normal access behavior for your SQL database. And if it sees something out of whack, something that's a bit unusual, it will start emailing you. It'll also do things like detect SQL injection attacks and so on. But even things like the database is being accessed from an unusual location, it will send you an email and say, hang on, this was accessed from this data center or from this location, which is just really nice. Auditing. So again, Azure in general has audit for everything. You can audit all access to the SQL database and run reports on who accessed what data and when. You can also audit all the access to the portal. So if you want to know, who went and changed that setting or so on, you can see all of that in Azure. So that's another nice thing that is almost impossible to replicate on-prem. Finally, there's a very powerful tool called Log Analytics. It can track pretty much everything that happens, including you can send your own trace logs from your own applications into Log Analytics. And then you can sort of look at all the things that are going on, but you can also set up alerts. So for example, you might look at it and find out that on average, every hour you get 100 failed logins in your system. So you might want to set up an alert that says, if I get 200 failed logins within an hour, then send me an alert. Or if you all of a sudden get a spike in 404s or 403s, because that might mean somebody's scanning you or somebody's trying to do a privilege escalation attack. And that can be quite useful too, because you're probably not going to find that out any other way. And Log Analytics can basically alert you to say, hang on, something is a bit different there. GDPR is a big subject, as is Azure, so I've just really covered the highlights today. If you want to know more about GDPR, have a look at our website, neworbit.co.uk/GDPR. We have written a bunch of articles, and no, you don't have to register to download them. They're just there for you to read. We've co-authored them with our solicitors, and that goes into a lot more detail about the GDPR aspects that we talked about today. If you want any help with moving to Azure or looking at the security implication, talk to us at New Orbit, contact details on the website, and we can help you with that. If you want to talk about GDPR Azure, you can ping me on Twitter. Always happy to chat. I also recommend Troy Hunt's course, the GDPR Attack Plan. It's a very good course that just sort of can get you started. And also, I do suggest you download the whole regulation. It sounds scary, but it actually has this thing at the start called the recitals. And if you read that, that's the principles of the law written in plain English. So you don't have to read all of the legal jargon. You can just read that, and that's quite useful. And as a final thought to leave you with, if you go onto Facebook, they actually have got an ability for you to download a copy of all the data that Facebook has about you. They don't call it subject access request, but it's there nonetheless. It's fairly deeply buried in settings. But go look for it and just have a look. A, because it's a good example of how to implement a subject access request, and B, just because it's quite interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been useful, and I hope you'll come back and watch some more of the webinars that Microsoft is publishing at the moment. Thank you very much for your time.